Have you been looking for a configuration to host your Angular app on App Engine? Well, today I'll be covering debugging an Angular app with an Express web server, and it's going to be hosted on App Engine. I'll cover Visual Studio Code debugging. I'll set some breakpoints for both the client and server. I'll use Travis CI to deploy the application to App Engine. Most of all, I think you'll get excited how simple it is to debug, build, and deploy an Angular app to App Engine. So let's get started. So the very first thing I want to do is show you the GitHub project that I'm using for this video tutorial. And I'll leave a link to this repo in the description of this video below. Now that that's done, let's just cover real quick how the architecture of this project looks. To start off, I have a client application, and this is my Angular application that I've generated, and I named it client. Then I created a server directory, and this is an Express web server, and I'll cover this more in a moment. At the root of the project, I have a package.json, and this package.json is used to download the libraries and install and glue the pieces together for the deployment. And I'll cover that towards the end. So the very first thing I want to do is just highlight the npm install process. So that's the Node Package Manager instructions for downloading the libraries for both the client and server. So once you fork the repo, you'll want to initialize the project by downloading the dependent libraries. So how would I do that? I'm going to go to the terminal. So I'm going to right click on the package.json and just say open in terminal. The reason why I did that was it just opens a terminal relative to the root of my project. I could right click anywhere in here and open it. So I'm going to run npm install, and this will initialize my project. It will download the libraries for both the client and server. And you can see those instructions in the package.json. After I've downloaded the libraries, I'm ready to debug my environment. I'll come back towards the end and talk about the build process and why I've added the instructions for the build process in the package.json. Okay, so let's get to the server debugging. Okay, so there's two things I could do to debug the server. One, I want to run it in VS Code, and two, there's another option, and what is that? And I will look at the package.json, and there is a script that I could run to start the node process, and that is npm run start. I won't be covering this because the real golden magic happens when I run it from VS Code. So let's get to that. I'm going to go to the run configurations, and I want to go up to the launchers. I've got two ready to go. And what are they? So let's go see what the launch configurations are about. So I'll click on the gear button, which takes me to the launch configurations. So I'm going to start by covering the server configuration, and then I'll come back and cover the client configuration. The server configuration is a node launcher. It launches the server. And what does that mean? I'm going to go to the program, and I want to set the workspace folder because in this architecture, I have both the client and server. So I need to specify where the entry point is located. So at the root of my project in the server directory, I have express.js, and I'll show that in a moment. I also have the current working directory set, so that way the launcher context is set to the server directory. Okay, so what is express.js? Let's take a look at that configuration. Express.js is my Express web server configuration. Right off, you may notice the port is set to 8080. And after that, I've got an HTML directory, which is the root of this project or execution process, and the HTML. So I'm running it from the server directory, so that means HTML is my directory for static resources. If I look at that directory, I have a simple HTML page in here, and I use the simple HTML page to verify the configuration of the express.js is wired correctly. So back to express.js. So I instantiate the service, and then I set the HTML directory, and after that, I've got an API endpoint that I wire up. And at this API endpoint, if you dial it up, it sends a response as API works, try API get message. And what is API get message? It's a simple response with a JSON object. It will say message, the board is green. And why do I have this here? I will use this in the client demo when I show how to set breakpoints on both the client and server side, and to verify all the pieces are wired up and working together for both the client and server. Okay, so that's it. It's really easy to wire up an Express web server and an Angular application. So what next? Let's debug this process and just make sure the server is working. So I'm going to start by going to the run context up to the launchers, and I'm going to hit run and start the process. And I'm going to go to debug console, and I can see the launcher has started the console output in this debug console. So I know the process is working. So let's dial it up on a web page and just verify that's the case. So I'm going to go to localhost 8080 and verify it works. This is for testing. This directory will be replaced with the client. Resources. Okay, great. The page loaded. The server is working. Now what? Let's check the other two API endpoints just to verify they are working too. API. Okay, API works. Now let's try API get message and see if it works and returns the JSON object. So let me click on that. Okay, great. The JSON works too. Now I'm all set and ready to go to debug the client. As you can see, it's really simple to wire up an Express web server alongside a client application. So let's get to debugging the client with the server. Okay, before I get to debugging the client, let me stop the process and I'll come back to that in a moment where I debug them together. So let's get to debugging the client. All right, for the client, it takes a few more steps to wire it up to work with the server configuration. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me start off with the angular.json configuration. In this file, there's a proxy configuration that I use for the server side. So I'm going to go to proxy. For the serve property, there's an options configuration, and I set a proxy configuration. What does that mean, or how does that look? Proxyconf.json. So I'm going to go to the proxy.conf.json. Well, in this configuration, I have /API. So with anything with the API endpoint, I set a reverse proxy with a target of localhost 8080. And this magically provides a nice reverse proxy to the endpoint on the server, so I don't have a lot of port confusion going on. And I'll show you what that means in a moment when I start to debug the process in the client. Okay, so I've showed you the magic wiring for the client and server-side experience. Now what? Well, I need to debug the client side, and I want to do that in VS Code. And there's two files or two configurations that I need to do that in VS Code. Okay, so what is that? First off, the task.json. I'm going to define this file and add it to the VS Code launcher context. Okay, so what will this do? This wires up the npm process with the launcher. And I'll cover that a little bit more when I get to the launcher. Most importantly, I go down, I want to highlight the options because you can copy this file and paste it into your project and away you go. You don't have to understand all the nitty-gritty to get going. But what you will have to understand is where your current directory is at. And depending on your project configuration, it may be in another location depending on how you named your app. In my case, I named my Angular app client. So I set the current working directory to client. And to note, you wouldn't have to set this unless you're in a different directory than the standard configuration. Okay, so on to the launch configuration. So I've got the second launch configuration already defined in my launch configurations array. And what that will do is launch Chrome. When it launches Chrome, it has a pre-launch task and it will start npm start. This links up with the task and runs the task. Okay, so it will start the Chrome process and launch the localhost on 4200. Now, if you notice, this is a different port than the Express web server. And that's why I had to set the proxy configuration. Okay, most importantly, I want to highlight that web root is set to the root of the project, and you can see I'm pointing it at the client directory. The rest of the properties I won't cover today in this video. I don't have to set anything else up but a launcher and task configuration. So now I'm ready to launch it from VS Code. So I'm going to go to the launch context and click on the launch. I'm going to only run the client-side configuration, which will launch ng-serve through npm start and start Chrome. So let me run that process and see how it works. The first thing that happens when I start the process, it will start the compiler with the pre-launch task because it called npm start, which then calls ng-serve. And then what happens is Chrome launches up. And over on the right, I see localhost 4200, the same configuration as in the launcher configuration. Okay, awesome. My application is working. What happens if I click on the button? Okay, there's an error. I can see the server-side process isn't running. Okay, now what? How do I debug them together? Okay, now I'm ready to run both of them together. But before I do that, I need to stop the previous process. And since it's running as a pre-launch task, I need to go down to the terminal and do a Control-C for a break. So I'm going to go Control-C. As you can see, that terminated the process and stopped the browser connection as well. Okay, so now I've cleaned up my processes. I'm ready to launch both of them together. So first off, I'm going to launch the server. I'm going to go to the Run context and then click Launch Server. I'll click on the debug console so I can see that it's started up. And after that, I'm going to go to the Launch in gserv and Chrome, the client-side context. So I'm going to hit Run and launch the client side. It will start the compiler and then the embedded web server and open up Chrome. Okay, great. Now, if everything works correctly, I could click on the button and it should return the board is green. So I'm going to click on try the local API request and it returns the board is green. So the entire process is wired up and ready to go. Well, that was pretty cool. Now let's just review the reverse proxy in a little bit more detail. First off, if I go up to the port 4200 and put /API, I should return the API endpoint just like it did on the server side earlier in this video. So I hit enter and great. It looks just like the server side context. And let's just review that because the server is running, I could go localhost 8080 /API and it returns the exact same thing. Well, that magic proxy file configuration sets up the wiring for this. Back to the client side. So I'm going to click on API get message. Okay, great. It returns the API through the reverse proxy. As you can see, it was pretty easy to wire up the process to debug the client and server. Okay, now I want to show you some of the magic. And what does that mean? Well, I want to show how to set breakpoints on both the client side and server side contexts. So that way you can debug both the client and server in VS Code. So I'm going to go over to the files and find some source code to set breakpoints on. So to start, I'm going to go to the client side and look for the source code that I've set up the methods that I want a breakpoint on. And that is in the app component. In the app, and I want to select the source code. In this case, it's TypeScript. And I've set a couple of methods up so I could breakpoint in here. And what are they? Well, I've provided a simple service called server message service. And what is that? Let's just review that code real quick. In this service, it's a simple GET request that fetches the API GET message, which is the message, the board is green. It returns that object as a server message. So when I fetch it, I can actually fetch it from my app component. So let's go back to the app component. What I want to do is set a breakpoint on handling of the click. And then I want to set a breakpoint after the message has been fetched. So this is after the server side. And then I also want to set a breakpoint on the server side. So I'm going to go to the server directory down to express.js. Now in a more complex project, I may be in a few classes, but in this case, I wanted to keep it simple. So I will add it right in between the endpoint, between the request and the response. Okay, so how would that work? So let's go ahead and reload the web page. So I'm going to hit the back button. Now that I'm back to the application, I'm going to click on it and it should break. And it did. Handle button click. Okay, that's awesome. Let me go to the debugging context on the left here. Now I can look at the variables within different scopes. And not only that, I could look at the launch stack as well. Okay, let me resume and go to the next breakpoint. All right, I'm on the server side and I could do the same exact thing. So I can look at the request, I can look at the response and inspect the variables and stack as well. So that's really cool. Let me resume. And voila, I'm back on the client. So that was slick. Let me just resume and continue the context. So for me, this is really an exciting experience to debug both the client and server together in the same context while rendering the application in Chrome. Okay, so that's pretty awesome. Now what? Now I want to send it up to App Engine. So how would I do that? So let's talk about the deployment process. So how do I put all this together and push it up to App Engine? Well, let's see how that works. So first off, I'm going to close the client and server directory, and I want to go to package.json. The first thing I want to cover is the build configuration. And what I do is in this context is I build everything and glue it together into the dist directory. So what does that mean? I take the server and I put it in the dist directory. And then in that dist directory, I will have an HTML folder and I will put the client in that HTML folder. And let me just run that. So I'm going to open up a new console. I'm in the root directory and I want to go npm run build. First off, it builds the Angular application, and then second, it copies the resources and puts them into the dist directory. So let's look at the dist directory output. Okay, so in the dist directory, I have the HTML directory, which has the Angular application or static resources. I have the node modules, which Express uses. There's the app.yaml, which is the App Engine configuration. And in this case, I'm setting the runtime to Node.js 10. The Express web server, which I covered earlier, the index.yaml, which is part of App Engine's indexes, and then the package.json. And then most important piece here is npm start needs to run the Express web server. When it gets to App Engine, it will call npm start and start up Express on port 8080. Okay, so that's great. I've got all the pieces built and ready to go. I want to test this all together from this dist directory. So how would I do that? Okay, before I do anything else, I need to stop the previous processes. So first off, I will stop the VS Code processes and go stop for both the server and Chrome. Then I'll come down to the terminal and stop the pre-launch process, which is Control C. And I'll do it again and it closes that. And now I can debug my package.json. And now I'm ready to debug the dist directory. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on package and open in terminal and go npm start. This will start the Express web server on port 8080. Okay, after it's started, I'm going to go over to the web page and dial in localhost 8080. Okay, great. Looks just like the client. I'm going to click on try local request and the board is green. So I know everything is working correctly. So I'm going to go Control C. Okay, now that I know it's glued together correctly in the dist directory, it's ready to be deployed. So how would I do that? So I'm going to show how I build it and deploy it. All right, I'm going to go to the travis.yaml. In this configuration, I'm going to cover this at a high level. And I won't cover the nitty gritty, but I have included my secret key and I've used Travis to encrypt it to include it in the repo. So what does that mean? So if I go over to GitHub, you can see Donaldson-sandbox and a random hash.json. This will get decrypted, which Travis uses to deploy my app to App Engine. Okay, so that's the first step. And to note, I also had to add permission for this user so they could deploy to App Engine. Okay, so after that, I'm going to tell Travis to run npm install on root, then npm run build, which builds the output to the dist directory. After that, I remove the orphan directories, which are now client and server because they're no longer needed, and a couple other files. And then I move all the files in the dist directory to the root context because I will be hosting the files from the root context on App Engine. After that, then Travis will deploy it, and it has a simple configuration format so I can deploy to my endpoint, which is Donaldson-sandbox. This plus appspot.com would be the endpoint of my project. Okay, so every time I make a commit, it will launch and build and deploy to App Engine. Let's just see that in action. Okay, so what I want to do is commit and send my changes up to my project. So I've already got a couple changes staged when I was reviewing the project. So I'm going to commit those by saying fixed build. And I'll commit these and then I'll go to get lens and push it up to master. Okay, great. Now I'll reload the project and I can see that commit came in. And what I want to do is I left a badge here to click on so I could go directly to Travis. And let's look at Travis in this context to see what happens. Once Travis sees the change, it will start the build. What's nice about Travis is it's really simple to configure and use for deploying to App Engine. If everything goes right, it will look just like what I did in my local environment. Okay, now that it's built the application, it's deploying to App Engine. Fantastic. Well, that was really easy to deploy my application to App Engine. So now let's check the endpoint out to see how it looks. So I'm going to go back to the GitHub and I have a quick link to click on to get to that endpoint. So under deploy, I'm going to click on donaldsonsandbox.appspot.com and it will load up the instance on App Engine. And now if I click on try local API request, it returns the board is green. So that's a pretty sweet experience when you look how simple it is to debug, build, and deploy an Angular application with Express Web Server on App Engine. I don't know about you, but this really excites me on how easy it is to get my apps out to the public. So that covers debugging Angular with an Express Web Server and hosted on App Engine today. Thanks for watching and follow me for more tips and tricks on debugging, and I'll catch you later.